Welcome to On the Record. I'm Christina Francis, Executive Director for JFF Labs, the innovation arm at Jobs for the Future.
I'm Michael Collins, Vice President at JFF, and I lead the Racial Economic Equity Initiative.
And I'm Tamisha Bridges-Mansfield, Vice President for Workforce Innovation at JFF.
JFF works at the national, state, and local levels, facilitating collaboration among leading educators, employers, workforce development specialists, entrepreneurs, and policymakers who share one goal, and that goal is to expand economic opportunity for all.
For the past 5 decades, there have been attempts to address racial economic inequality in the workplace in America, but there's still much work to be done.
More than 60% of Americans still believe that racial inequality needs to be addressed.
Over the course of the show, we'll be talking to key figures in education, technology, and entrepreneurs, all of whom are working hard to create opportunities and changes for Black learners and workers across the U.S.
And you can join the conversation by sending your questions and comments to us on Twitter at JFF Tweets and by following us on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram.
So over the last 3 years, I think we all have had the opportunity to reflect on COVID, the racial reckoning, the great resignation or awakening, whatever we want to call it. I'm curious, Tamisha, what you're thinking.
Yeah, I think what I've really been reflecting on the last 3 years is how much people are challenged by trying to navigate a really hard labor market. We didn't know when jobs were going to come back. We didn't know what the jobs were going to look like. People lost their jobs and are really just trying to figure out how to piece their lives together, understand what supports they need from their families, from their communities, from employers, and from the systems. And so it's a lot of figuring out and really reimagining what work is going to look like and how we need to support workers going forward.
Work and life. What are you thinking, Michael?
Well, I think, it's one of the reasons why we kind of launched the Racial Economic Equity Initiative. It's trying to make sense of what's happening in this moment for Black learners and workers, and it's happening with a laser focus on the lived experience of Black learners and workers, which we really haven't focused on as an education and training system, as a workforce system, and we've made some missteps in the labor market. So working with employers to try to redress some of that. So it's a tough time, but it's an opportune time to do some things differently and make sure that we have economic advancement for all, and that all includes this population that in many cases, I would argue, has been left behind.
Yeah,
absolutely.
One of the things we found in the Racial Economic Equity Initiative when we looked at what was happening to Black workers in the labor market is extreme occupational segregation. So Black learners and workers were not in programs and they weren't in jobs that are associated with high growth and high wages. And one of the key areas of concern was the lack of representation of Black learners and workers in digital and technology fields. Extreme kind of gaps in opportunity there. And so that was one of the first areas that we looked at to really try to increase opportunity.
No, I think that's really important because I think when we think about jobs in tech and jobs in the digital economy, we automatically think of, oh, people need to go to Austin or people need to go to San Francisco or wherever. But there's actually tech jobs right in people's communities. They're at the hospitals, right? They're at local companies. And so it's like, how do you make sure that people have not just opportunity, but that local companies know that they have candidates right there in their community that they can actually tap into and give jobs and opportunities. So there's just a lot of need to open up that pipeline, both of workers and also the lens of employers back in the community to find that talent.
And the pipeline doesn't start and end with hiring. We've got to look at retention. We've got to look at advancement. We've got to look at promotion. And so these are things that we'll talk about. Well, let's take a look at some of the facts around all of the issues.
Less than 5% of employees at major technology companies are Black, even though Black students account for 9% of computer science graduates. Black businesses with more than one employee make up just 2% of all businesses in the United States.
Those are some really surprising statistics that we just heard. I think for me, what stands out is the piece around computer science graduates, and that really there's a much broader place of education for people to get the skills to get into the tech field. It's not just about four-year bachelor's degrees, there's boot camps, there's all other ways that we can look at how people can learn the skills to get them into the door.
What's really promising are the alternative pathways or non-traditional opportunities that people will have to learn new skills, to explore new careers. Well, let's dive deeper into the role that education plays in advancement. Our colleague Naima Mitchell traveled to Baltimore to catch up with Freeman Hrabowski, president of UMBC, University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Later this year, he will retire after 30 years of what many have called transformational leadership.
From Birmingham,
Yes.
Alabama.
Yes.
And growing up in the 50s and 60s
Yes.
obviously had a big influence on
Sure.
who you are in your career. Can you
Sure.
talk a little bit about that?
Sure.
Growing up during the height of the civil rights.
You know, I was very privileged to be a part of the Children's March in Birmingham, and the one statement made by Dr. King at my church at 6th Avenue Baptist when I was 12, I'm sitting in the back of the room, and he said this: if the children participate in this peaceful protest, all of America will understand that even children know the difference between right and wrong. And what the statement, and he said, and they'll be able to go to better schools. Now, we had some great black teachers, but we didn't have the resources. And all of a sudden he said something that I'll never forget: tomorrow can be better than today. And those were not his words, but that was the message, that tomorrow would be better than today. And that children could feel empowered to help with that. Now, that's what I learned from Birmingham, not just from that, but from my church and my community and my schools and my home, that we needed to feel empowered, not victims, to make a difference in our own lives. That's the message of that period for children and for all of us.
How do you believe that we can help both political and educational leaders understand that, you know, hundreds of years of racism still shows up in how black people experience our education system?
Sure. Somehow we have to stress the importance of history. There's no way to get around that. We have to know our history. I don't need to use special language that academics use. We need to know our story. As Americans, when we talk about African American history, it is American history. And our history, our lives are intertwined. My last name, Hrabowski, comes because my great-great-grandfather was the Polish slave master. So our families are intertwined in interesting ways. And the history of a people, of a country, will always have the good and the challenging. That is because we as human beings are not perfect. Somehow we have to get people to understand. You don't learn that overnight. It takes a deep understanding. It takes reading and thinking and discussing, and having the tough conversations and building trust so we do hear the different perspectives. It won't happen quickly, but we've never fully had those tough conversations. I know the challenge, but when it comes to education in general, you look at what happens to children of color and poor children in this country, first generation. So many start off and they have to start in developmental, remedial kinds of work, and they never get beyond that. And there are 2 points there. We've got to do more for K through 12, pre-K through 12. We've got to have more emphasis on tutoring and reading skills and thinking skills and discipline in those things, and teaching them to believe in themselves, number one. And number two, we really have to think about how we redesign the approach we use. The student bodies are becoming increasingly diverse, of color, Black, Latino, and others, and yet they don't see people like themselves, number one. Number two, we are accustomed to thinking about students who've had the college experience. Universities are really very good with students who've already had the college experience, meaning generations of college. All right, then you know how things work, and you can call your parents and get. But the fact is, most people don't know this. 2/3 of America's families have never had anyone graduate from a four-year college or complete a program of the right kind. So they've not had the experience. So we have to find ways of listening to their perceptions, to the perceptions of students in a training program, in a 2-year college, and a 4-year university. What's the experience like for you? Do you feel we're being supportive? How else can we be supportive of you in what you're doing? We need to do much more of that, we say here, and we need to think about focus groups, but also using analytics. If we see that 2/3 of young women of color go through whatever program it is, and they don't make it. Something's wrong. Have we looked at their backgrounds? Do we understand what skills they bring? Are they motivated to do it? How else might we motivate them? And so when I think about the issues of racism, as well as discrimination against people from first-generation backgrounds, those would be the factors. So looking at the diversity at the administrative level, at the professoriate level, and then at the systems in place. Are there systems in place that will deal with these issues? I mean, having offices of equity and inclusion are important, but do those offices have any power? Or are they there just to check, you see? We only get really involved about racism, for example, when there's a big protest in the outside world or on our campus. Then everybody's worried. But the question is, what are you doing when there's no protest? What are you doing to hear what your students are saying?
So in thinking about a message for employers as more learners are entering the workforce, and in particularly thinking about those major corporations that are working hard to recruit, particularly Black students and Black learners into their workforce, what do they need to be doing to get ready for them?
Those companies that are most enlightened will have internships, because internships will allow students of color and others to come and work in the summers or during the year, learn more about the business, whether it's in defense or in finance. Right. Paid internships is very important because students of color can't just afford, as a rule. Most, even middle-class students of any race really, can't afford just to be. We need partnerships, multi-level partnerships between companies and community colleges and universities. For us, it's partnerships that will involve people from the company being on advisory boards here in different disciplines, whether it's in engineering or in humanities. People who will take grad courses here to get to know us. People who will come and teach a course or part-time or a visiting lecturer. Having opportunities for faculty and students to work in the company. We need to know what the demands are. I mean, what is it? How many jobs are we talking about in what areas? And secondly, we need to know how many people are available in those areas. One of the most enlightened approaches employers use is to work with educational institutions to develop programs that will meet their needs. That's involving the curriculum, that's involving internships, and most important, it's constant feedback. The hope I see comes from my students because they're saying, knock down barriers and take names, kicking butt and taking names. They've got that emphasis that they will not be pushed down. That's what I like about this generation, that they will not accept no for an answer. They will not give up. And it's that hope of this younger generation we need to all have.
That was JFF's Naima Mitchell talking to Freeman Hrabowski, president of UMBC. What do you think about the issues raised in that interview? Do you believe that educational institutions are doing enough to prepare Black students for the world of work?
You can send us your questions or comments on Twitter or LinkedIn.
Post-secondary is really important because it's about optionality. Someone who might complete a credential might get a traditional job, but they also might want to become an entrepreneur or start a business.
Such a great point, Michael, and I'm so excited that entrepreneurship is actually an option for so many Black people. However, there's still statistics that show across all of the U.S. companies, only 2% are Black-owned that have more than one employee. There is no metro area in the U.S. that has a share of Black-owned employer firms that matches or exceeds the Black population in that area. But the figure is rising. We went to meet 2 entrepreneurial business owners in the D.C. area who are working to change things.
Rather than just having this prototypical client base of white women who are serviced by white women and Black men, we want to have white men, Black women, Asian American women and men, Latin American women and men, not only enjoying the services, but having someone they can relate to when they walk in here. My name is Chris Perrin. I'm the co-owner of Cut 7. This is our outdoor location. We have 2 locations and a pop-up in Washington, D.C. So we started thinking about doing this forum, getting some Black women business owners, health professionals, some doctors, and having a discussion about what are the barriers that are stopping Black women from coming into boutique fitness.
So we're both working on a forum about Black women in fitness. And so we've had a couple of discussions with Chris over the past couple of weeks about the lack of diversity in having Black women as coaches in the city.
So the idea was to show representation, right? Because we are in a very white dominant industry.
We want this community and this city to be better. And if we're gonna be better, we can't just pay attention to Black people 1 month. This has to be year round. If you're gonna be in this community and live here, you have a responsibility to give to it.
Marjani Beauty is a destination for women of color to find community, to shop, to learn, and discover beauty. We exclusively feature 100% Black and Brown owned beauty brands, and that is our focus, to be a place where women can feel safe. It's important that I not only highlight Black and Brown owned beauty brands, but also behind the scenes, I am really intent on hiring vendors and employees and business partners that look like me as well. It's really a 360 approach in trying to give Black and Brown women an opportunity. It's now known that less than 10% of Black-owned beauty brands occupy spaces in national beauty retailers. And so for me, creating this space where 100% of the brands are Black and Brown owned, if you're sitting in a room and everyone in that room looks just like you, but you're making policies and procedures for everyone in the company and they don't look like you, I think that's a problem. With diversity of demographics comes diversity of thought, and with diversity of thought, that's when you can truly feel it just really penetrating in a more cultural way.
With us here today in the studio is Raël Nelson James, who is a partner and the head of equity at the Bridgespan Group. Raël, it's great to have you here. You have an amazing range of experience and you've been at this for a while. I'm curious, how are you experiencing this moment? I mean, the DEI issues are so salient and so front and center, and you've got that historical arc. How are you feeling about this moment?
You know, on the one hand, I feel like the spotlight has done a lot of really positive things for, various sectors where people who had never taken on DEI or equity work feel a little external pressure to do so now. And on the other hand, it's, kind of puzzling as someone who has really grown up with the notion of inequity being a constant. It was sort of shocking to me in a way, especially in 2020, to see how many people were having this newfound awakening around the, very persistent marginalization and oppression that are woven through our own society as well as societies around the world. With that said, I think it's incumbent upon those of us who care about this work and about the progress that we think it'll bring about to really harness the momentum of the moment into some real impact for the world and the things that we care about in the workplace and outside the workplace.
Absolutely. I know my colleagues have.
Yeah. So many questions for you. I'm curious, moving the needle and moving towards the momentum, what one issue right now, if you could focus your time on, would that be where you believe we can actually move the needle?
I mean, I think a lot about the composition of workplaces and how to make space for groups that are historically excluded. And I think that's really important, right? Really changing the composition of the workforce. And I think that's an incomplete way of thinking about what it will take to really make change for sectors, including nonprofit, including tech, including these places where we have the largest employers. I think there's an undervalued piece, which is working on the culture and the way that it feels to be at work, right? It's not just enough to
so important.
Fill the bucket if there's a hole in the bottom. That leak will always be a barrier to progress. And so I think it's about actually looking at and thinking about the structures and the processes and the real ways in which your organization either feels inclusive to or exclusive to people who have been historical historically marginalized. And what that looks like is really rethinking everything from the way we welcome staff to the way we evaluate staff to the role of formalizing some of the things that the people in the majority just by default get the benefit of. So mentorship and sponsorship. How are you thinking about that, especially in industries where the senior leadership is less diverse than your more junior team? You need to figure out ways in which the organization can bridge that gap and make sure that people at the start of their careers or at the start of their journey at your company are really set up for success.
So I'm curious about how you navigate the complexity of diversity and the issues around kind of anti-Blackness. I mean, I have experienced people wanting to do diversity very broadly, and that's important, but I also realize sometimes that issues around Black people get lost in that. How do you think about that?
Yes, this is a great question. You know, when we started this racial equity work, I would say to people, you know, I heard somewhere that if you don't put race at the center of the table, that it'll fall off the edge. And so much of like corporate diversity that has been focused on women has ended up only benefiting white women because it didn't have the most marginalized groups at the center of the design effort. And so we really tried to use what Angela Glover Blackwell calls the curb cut effect to think about who we're designing for, with the idea that if Bridgespan becomes a place that is good at retaining, at developing, at promoting, at attracting, you know, marginalized staff, Black people, Black women, that it will also be a great employer for everyone else. And I think that's true. I think that the kinds of investments that we've made, from, you know, student loan assistance to revamping the way that we develop and evaluate our staff, have really benefited everyone, right? Even though they may have been designed in particular to support our racial equity efforts.
So you talked earlier about being a part of DE&I, but it's kind of a second job, not your primary job, right?
Well, now it's my whole job.
Previously. We're starting to see in the last couple of years people who are going into DE&I not getting the supports they need. I'm just curious what you've seen in that arc, just in transition for DE&I professionals, and then as a DE&I professional, how are you self-caring?
Oh, great question. Let's see, you know, I think there has been, and I mean, nonprofits are sort of different because there are real financial constraints that keep people from growing their DEI team in the way that it really needs to be to make significant change. I think a lot of people underestimate what this work really is, right? Like, what I tell my colleagues is, my fundamental ask of Bridgespan is to be better than the society in which it exists, right? So these inequities are going on all around us. It's the soup that we're all in. And when we come to work, I'm asking you to do pretty radical things, right? Like be in a white accountability group together, or, you know, think about the ways in which caste in India is fundamentally problematic to some of the goals that we're trying to achieve as a company, as an organization. And that's a big ask. And I think one of the things that's happened over the last several years, and particularly in the aftermath of George Floyd's killing and the subsequent uprisings, is that the space has gotten really crowded with really well-meaning people, but who have a really broad set of skills. Some people are organizational design experts. Some people are really about training. And so one thing is just getting clear on what your company needs and investing there first. Because without willing senior leadership, without the structures that really are going to support that DEI person, no matter what their budget is, it's going to be really hard for them to be successful. And so sometimes I suggest, you know, maybe get a consultant first and have that person do an audit and think about what are the necessary conditions before you make your first in-house DEI hire that will set that person up for success. Because we see a lot of turnover and short tenures for people in DEI, which gets to your question about self-care too, right? Like 2020 truly burned me out. I can really say that candidly to y'all. Like, it really burned me out. I was like, I don't know if I can deal with all the noise outside of the organization and then also a set of tasks that are like I was already working on, right? So this external circumstance sort of heightened the focus and the spotlight that my work had, but actually it was the same work, and it's still the same work. It's the same work from 1954 as right now. You know, it's a continuum of the acquisition of rights and of full personhood, and the workplace is just one place where we have the opportunity to do some interventions that we think will be meaningful. But really, what my hope is as a Black woman in the society is that, like, in demonstrating what's possible for a company like Bridgespan, people will take that and use it as a model and a microcosm for what might be possible in their communities, in their families, around their dinner table, right? And so it's that kind of ripple effect that I think is important. By focusing on the workplace, we actually hope to impact society in some greater way.
Well, thank you for being here with us today. And we'd love to hear from you. You can send us your questions and comments on Twitter, LinkedIn, or Instagram, and we can continue the conversation about all the stories and issues raised on the show. Let's take a quick moment to do a fact check.
For every dollar of wealth that white households in America have, African American households have just 10 cents. African Americans comprise of 12.4% of the U.S. population, but only 7.4% of the tech workforce. 6 in 10 Black adults would consider a career change to technology, but they are unsure where to start.
The data is powerful, but it loses its meaning if we don't also focus on the humans behind the numbers.
In the next film, we want to introduce Loianne. She's been working in the tech industry for the last 8 years. She's going to give us some insight into how things have been for her, some of the challenges she's faced, and what life is like now as an employee of tech giant Google.
My name is Loianne Gregory. I'm an industry intelligence analyst at Google, and I work specifically with pharma clients. Went to Bucknell for undergrad, started grad school, and I got an internship at SAP through my grad program. Higher ed in general is incredibly segregated. Bucknell was not only very white, but a very specific kind of white. So I've lived in the Bronx most of my life, I went to very diverse schools, and then I ended up at Bucknell, which was not only not ethnically diverse, also not very socioeconomically diverse. And that was really, really difficult. I did not feel like I had the same opportunities and options as my white classmates. The amount of students who had things set up based on their parental connections was astounding. When I was an intern at SAP, I worked in the global marketing headquarters in New York. I was one of 3 Black people on my floor. So think about a company marketing organization of 1,500 people. You work in marketing headquarters and there are only 2 other people who look like you. I remember I had someone who volunteered to be my mentor, who does that, and asked me if I felt the reason I wasn't getting hired full-time was because of my hair and my nose ring. And it was very illuminating because I had never even really thought about that. But it wasn't even a micro, that was like macroaggression, passive aggressive. I don't know what changed after that conversation, but one thing that I started thinking about was there's gonna be somebody else who looks like me coming down the pike. And she's gonna enter a space that will be uncharted too. Maybe it'll be the same space that I was in. And if I leave this space not having left some kind of mark, not having cracked the ceiling just a little bit, whether that be just simply by wearing sneakers or having a nose piercing or wearing my hair out, I would have done her a disservice. In 2022, we're still not entering on an equal footing. When companies think about hiring people of color, Black people, they don't think about retaining Black people. I really think simply the conversation is not just about hiring Black talent, but about keeping Black talent, about nurturing Black talent, about promoting Black talent, about, creating and helping to create the pipeline for Black leaders, not just, entry-level junior Black people at your company. That's not enough. That's half of the story.
That was Loianne, who lives in New York City and is a full-time employee at Google. So much of what Loianne said resonated with me, as I started my tech career, being one of the only ones in the group, not having a lot of people to talk to, not really understanding the dynamics of the workplace. I'm curious what you all thought.
I was struck by just the small numbers. I mean, like that, so there are thousands of Black people that aspire to work in digital and technology and at such large companies, not just Google, but in other companies. So few Black technologists are in technology roles. And in some ways, for me, I know that there's been progress, but that is astounding, those small numbers.
So few Black people, so few Black women, and so few Black women and Black leaders that are leading actually tech teams. What do you think?
Yeah,
Tanisha?
I think what struck me is that I think we spend a lot of time focusing on making sure that people have the skills that they need, but we don't talk as much about how they experience work. Right, and that she just felt lonely, and I've experienced that, and that even when she had mentorship, it was mentorship that stung, and wasn't really supportive of her, and so it brought back things for me, and it also made me really hope that companies are a lot more intentional about how workers are treated, right? Particularly Black workers. I think we spend a lot of time focusing on getting people in the door and not nearly as much time about what their experience needs to be like. What is the culture that they're walking into? Does the culture work for them? And we really need to pay more attention to that if we want the numbers to grow and let alone, maintain.
Yeah, I love that she brought up the retention and advancement because to your point, a lot of Black workers get mentored. They don't get sponsored to that next level.
Yes.
So what do we need to help them get there?
Yeah, and we know the data is really clear that Black people in kind of the tech positions, they don't stay as long as other race people, and so you have kind of a churn, right, which has implications for internal mobility. And the number of Black people in leadership, who are directors, I mean, it's in the single digits, tech directors, and it's really hard. I mean, I don't know if I believe you can't be what you can't see, but it's certainly harder, right? We can be because we are often the first, right? But it is certainly harder, and it must be just a very difficult and lonely climb. I thought that she was very compelling in describing her experience.
I think it also made me think about my role and our role as Black leaders, right? As people come into organizations, what is our role in terms of mentorship? What is our role in terms of sponsorship? What is our role in terms of modeling and supporting, right, Black people as they come into these positions?
As a leader of color, it's also kind of astounding to me that we are, for the first time, really talking about this population. I've worked for close to 30 years, and I was never able to really name this population in the way that it needed to be named. I always had to couch it. I had to say low-income people. I had to say people of color. I had to really say everything but Black people or Black learners and workers. So I think that there's also been some regression. Why are we having to name some of these issues for the first time ever?
And it feels awkward for us, right? You and I had this conversation. Now that we actually can do it, it still doesn't feel quite right in doing so.
And we don't have the language for it. I mean, I find myself stumbling trying to explain, kind of structural inequality, structural racism, and I'm looking at my audience and I got to make it palatable. How much can they take? Am I able to, right? And even internally, right? You want to engage people, bring people, build allies, but some of the conversation is hard, right? So you're constantly parsing, and we haven't built the muscle, And so I find myself, being pretty inarticulate sometimes, stumbling through what I need to say, So it's again progress, but I also think there's been a little bit of retrenchment in this area, right? So Black leaders, I mean, very seriously, are carrying a lot. There is the emotional labor of this work, and many of them, I mean, it's the Great Resignation, right? It's the endless Zoom meeting, and issues of kind of self-care are kind of front and center, kind of in the headlines. But I believe that Black leaders are carrying a really heavy load. I'm just curious, your thoughts about, and even maybe yourself, how are you?
I think what I am becoming clearer on is the importance of boundaries, right? And one of the things I talk to folks about is what are the things that you enthusiastically say yes to, and what are the things that you strategically say no to? And that you're just really clear on, this is the lane that I want to be in, this is what I want to do, this is where I want to go. And when you're called on to do things that may be outside of that, It's about having the courage to say no, because if you keep saying yes to things, right, the effectiveness goes down. And so for me, a critical part of self-care, work-wise and otherwise, is on boundaries.
Yeah, for me, I'll do a personal and then a professional one. I think professionally, I feel a lot of pressure and opportunity to make the right decisions on partnerships, right? And to make sure that we're really leaning into the work that we say we want to do and serving the populations that we want. So one, for me, self-care is identifying those partners that we otherwise wouldn't had I not been at the table. I think personally, it is identifying the people that give me the energy to get through. Like, you know, you and I talk a lot. How are you, and you and I as well, how do you pull those people that you're working with internally to give you that power and that courage and that strength to get through those times that are just inherently tough?
Yeah, I have an amazing partner. We talk a lot about these things. Dana, you know, helps me kind of have the right kind of mindset. I think family is so critical and important. I have an 11-year-old. And in some ways, they're with me in this work. My son one time, and that's good and bad, right? My son at one point was like, you know, Dad, these are all the things you talk about. You only talk about, and I'm just like, I don't want to be reduced to like, right, like, but at the same time, like these are critical issues, and I guess I'm making the point that some of us aren't able to separate our professional and our personal in this particular kind of topic.
When I was younger, a younger professional, just knowing that someone saw me and reflected back what they saw in me, the good and the things that they was, you know, pulled my coattails on a little bit, right? But I think that younger, you know, Black staff need to know that they are seen as people and that their work and their labor is valuable. You have to show like a care and a concern and an investment on both sides.
Yeah, it's to what you said earlier. It's you know, the data is powerful, but there's humans behind that, and really making sure we're paying attention to that.
Yeah, I think about, you know, Martin Luther King's letter to a Birmingham jail. That letter was to his peers. It was to his colleagues, and essentially, you know, he had a different walk, right? He had a different sense of urgency, and I'm not suggesting that allies don't think issues are urgent, but I do worry sometimes about some of the younger Black professionals on their journey and their organizations not understanding sometimes that the walk is different. So if you're a young person of color, you have experienced kind of the world on your way to work. By the time you get to work and sit down in your office, right, like all kinds of things might have happened to you, right? Like you are engaging kind of in our systems and our institutions. And, you know, I'm not sure all workplaces, right, have that awareness of kind of what their employees of color, you're a young Black man, you are commuting to work, like all manner of experiences, you know, can be had. And so, you know, I'm hopeful. You know, we did a scan of some organizations that have built a technology app to help companies actually assess, like in real time, how they're doing on some DEI indicators. So imagine a young Black man coming in, maybe he had an experience that, you know, was jarring on the way to work, and able to kind of share that, and the organization have some sense of like, you know, some care, you know, taking that needs to happen for this individual. I would love to see getting back to the kind of progress and the retrenchment, like that. I think that is progress, and I'd like to see more of that in support of young professionals.
Well, there's so much that we can talk about. But thank you for joining us. You've been watching On the Record, presented by Jobs for the Future.
And remember, you can continue the conversation. We'd love to hear from you. You can contact us on Twitter, Facebook, and on email.
Until next time, bye-bye.